Standard military doctrine is essentially a contract. It tells a soldier, if you hold your fire, if you wait for dawn, and if you wait for support, you maintain the element of surprise and you survive the night. At 2:15 a.m. on June 8, 1944, Private First Class Vernon Hayes crouched in the darkness of a Norman barn loft and decided to tear that contract up. Below him, 9 Wehrmacht soldiers advanced through the ground floor, moving with the confidence of men who owned the darkness. The manuals said to let them pass, but Vernon Hayes was not your typical 19-year-old recruit. At 34 years old, he was technically too old for combat infantry by Army standards. The 82nd Airborne only took him because, after the chaos of D-Day, they desperately needed warm bodies. What they got, however, was not just another rifleman. They got a Kansas wheat farmer who understood the brutal, simple physics of the physical world better than most engineering students. In the next 4 minutes, Hayes eliminated all 9 German soldiers. He did not use his rifle. He did not pull the pin on a grenade. He didn't fire a single shot. When the rest of the German company arrived later, they spent 3 days tearing the structure apart, searching for a sniper nest that simply did not exist. They were looking for a muzzle flash or a hidden firing port. They failed to understand that they hadn't been attacked by a weapon of war, but by a principle of nature. Hayes had turned their own tactical doctrine against them, proving that in the noise and fury of mechanized warfare, the most lethal force is often the one that makes no sound at all. Back in Salina, Kansas, farming was not the romanticized agriculture of recruitment posters. It was gritty, dangerous, and exhausting work. For Vernon Hayes, his basic training didn't begin at Fort Benning. It began in the sweltering heat of a Kansas summer, 18 years before he ever put on a uniform. The work was visceral. It meant 100-degree heat, chaff permanently lodged in your throat, and splinters under every fingernail. But more importantly, it was a practical education in physics that no military classroom could replicate. Hayes spent those 18 summers loading hay bales into lofts, mastering the behavior of heavy objects in freefall. He learned early on that a hay bale isn't just animal feed, it is a 60-pound projectile. He understood that if a bale is dropped from 20 feet, it generates enough kinetic energy to crush a man's skull if he is standing in the wrong spot. The mechanism for this labor was the hay chute. These were wooden channels built directly into the barn floors, smoothed by decades of friction, designed to send hay from the high loft to the ground level without the back-breaking labor of carrying it down ladders. It was simple, gravity-fed efficiency. Drop a bale at the top and let Newton's laws do the rest. By the time the war started, Hayes had dropped an estimated 10,000 bales through those chutes. He possessed an intuitive, almost muscular memory of vertical ballistics. He knew exactly what 60 pounds felt like in his hands. He knew the specific thud a bundle made when hitting packed earth. Most critically, he knew the margin of error was tight, about 6 inches. When he looked at a barn, he didn't just see a building. He saw angles, drop zones, and terminal velocity. He knew that a 60-pound object, whether made of dried wheat or something harder, accelerated at a specific rate and arrived with devastating finality. This was knowledge that seemed utterly useless for a paratrooper dropping into the chaos of Normandy. But war has a way of turning the mundane into the essential. Hayes was a farmer who knew more about gravity and angles than most engineering students, and he was about to apply that education in the most brutal way imaginable. To understand why a disciplined soldier would eventually discard his orders, you have to understand the specific type of hell that was the Normandy bocage. By June 7th, German patrols owned the night. These were 9-man squads moving through the darkness like wolves, utilizing maps they had memorized over 4 years of occupation. They killed anyone they found after midnight. That was exactly when Tommy Eugene Morrison died. Morrison was a 22-year-old kid from Pittsburgh who had worked in his father's butcher shop before the war. He and Hayes had been strangers until the jump, but 8 hours of combat had forged that peculiar, instant brotherhood that only exists under fire. At 11:40 p.m. on June 7th, they were pulling perimeter watch in a farmhouse basement. Morrison went upstairs to check the road. Hayes heard the change in rhythm first. He heard boots on the floorboards above, harder heels than American issue. Then he heard Morrison's voice, trying to surrender in broken German, followed immediately by the distinctive mechanical rip of an MP40. 17 rounds. Hayes counted every single one. When Hayes reached the base of the stairs, the patrol was already gone. dawn. He found Morrison thrown backward by the impact, his helmet gone, blood pooling on the limestone floor. The air was thick with the smell of cordite mixed with something metallic and sweet. But the detail that broke Vernon Hayes wasn't the blood, it was the heat. When he touched Morrison's hands, they were still warm. Hayes realized then that the body doesn't understand when it is finished. He also realized that standard doctrine, the rules that said hold your position and wait for support, was a suicide pact. The math simply didn't work. 1 rifleman in a basement against 9 men with automatic weapons results in a dead American every time. That night, Hayes couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the warmth leaving his friend's hands and smelled the gun oil on his own rifle, which now smelled too much like blood. The official manuals had failed Eugene Morrison. Hayes decided he would not rely on them again. The following day, Hayes's squad occupied a farm complex 2 miles west of Sainte-Mère-Église. The company commander ordered observation posts established in the barn lofts, seeking high ground and good fields of fire. When Hayes climbed the ladder, he stepped into a space that felt both eerily familiar and distinctly foreign. It was a Norman hay barn, but to a Kansas farmer, the architecture felt wrong. The floor was concrete rather than wood, poured over wooden planks, and the space was too clean, too new. But in the northwest corner, Hayes found the one architectural feature that transcended culture, a wooden hay chute. It was a simple 8-inch square hole that dropped straight through the floor, creating a 23-foot vertical tunnel to the ground level. Hayes stared at that chute. The wood around the rim was polished smooth by decades of friction, worn down by generations of farmers dropping hay to livestock below. It was the exact same gravity-fed system he had used back home, but as he looked down the shaft, seeing the moonlight hitting the stone floor below, the context shifted in his mind. In Kansas, the barns had packed earth floors to cushion the fall of the bales. Here the floor was hard limestone. He thought about the sound a 60-pound bale made hitting earth, a dull thud. Then he imagined the sound of a 60-pound object hitting stone from 23 feet up. He thought about density. Hay compresses, broken bricks do not. That night, haunted by the memory of the German patrol that had butchered his friend, Hayes couldn't sleep. At 3 a.m. he made a decision that would change the tactical landscape of the sector. He climbed back into the loft, not with a rifle, but with his entrenching tool. Hayes began to re-engineer the battlefield. Working in total darkness to avoid alerting nearby patrols, he started digging at the floor. The concrete was only 2 inches thick. He pried it up, chunk by chunk, widening the chute opening from its original 8 inches to a more lethal 14 inches. The dust that rose up was a mixture of pulverized concrete and ancient hay chaff, a taste that coated his throat, indistinguishable from a Kansas wheat field in August. Crucially, he didn't just make the hole bigger, he refined it. He took his bayonet and shaved the wooden edges of the chute until they were slick. He wanted 0 friction. He needed a clean, silent drop. Finally, he gathered his ammunition. He took 3 sandbags from the perimeter defenses and filled them with jagged, broken bricks from a collapsed wall. He weighed them in his hands, between 55 and 65 pounds each. They were heavy, crude, and ungainly, but to Hayes, they were perfect. He stacked them silently next to the widened chute. The trap was set. The barn was no longer an agricultural building. It was a gravity-powered guillotine, and Vernon Hayes was holding the rope. At 1:30 a.m. on June 8th, the wait ended. Hayes had been motionless in the loft for 6 hours, listening to the silence, when he heard the distinctive crunch of boots on gravel 1. A 9-man German patrol entered the ground floor, the same size as the squad that had killed Eugene Morrison. They moved with the routine arrogance of occupiers, lighting cigarettes and chatting, unaware that the ceiling above them had been converted into a weapon. Hayes sat in the dark, running the numbers one last time. He knew that gravity is a constant mistress. From a height of 23 feet, his 60-pound sandbags would hit a terminal velocity of roughly 24 miles per hour. That might not sound fast compared to a bullet, but physics tells a different story. A 60-pound object moving at that speed carries about 280 foot-pounds of energy, roughly the same impact force as a .44 Magnum round. The difference is, a bullet punches a hole. A sandbag pulverizes everything it touches. Through the 14-inch gap in the floorboards, Hayes saw a helmet stop directly in the kill slot. He didn't hesitate. He released the first bag. It fell for exactly 1.2 seconds. The sound wasn't the crack of a rifle. It was a wet, heavy thud, like a mallet hitting a side of beef. The German soldier, a man his comrades called Müller, collapsed instantly. The remaining 8 men didn't scramble for cover immediately because there was no muzzle flash, no supersonic crack of a bullet. They simply thought Müller had stumbled in the dark. When a second German stepped into the light to check on his fallen comrade, Hayes dropped the second bag. Another thud, another body on the stone floor. Now panic set in. The German patrol fell back on their training, but their training was useless against a vertical threat they couldn't see. They sprayed the ceiling with MP40 fire, but they were guessing, aiming at the wrong sections of the loft. Hayes lay flat, letting the splinters rain down around him, counting the muzzle flashes. He realized that the Germans had made a fatal error. They had taken cover behind hay bales along the walls, effectively pinning themselves down. Hayes now had to break the rules of engagement to finish the job. He needed them to move. He picked up his M1 Garand, not to kill, but to herd them. He fired 3 rounds through the floorboards at a random angle. The noise terrified the Germans. Thinking the sniper had shifted positions, they broke cover and ran directly into the kill zone. Hayes dropped the 5th sandbag one-handed while holding his rifle, a sloppy technique that would have failed in inspection but worked in combat. It struck a running soldier in the shoulders, knocking him face first into the stone with bone-shattering force. Now only 2 Germans remained. They were professional, disciplined, and terrified. They froze, refusing to move. Hayes checked his watch. He had minutes before the noise drew the entire German company. He needed to bait them. In a move that would have court-martialed him in any other army, Hayes stood up. He walked across the creaking loft floor, silhouetting himself against the moonlight, effectively screaming, "I am here." The Germans took the bait. They opened fire and moved to get a better angle. As one soldier ran in an arc to flank the loft, Hayes tracked him by sound alone. He didn't look. He just listened to the boots on stone. He timed the drop to the rhythm of the footsteps. The last bag hit its mark. The soldier went down screaming. The final survivor, realizing he was fighting a ghost who dropped crushing weights from the sky, fled into the night. Inside the barn, silence returned. 8 men lay dead or dying on the floor. Hayes sat in the dark, hands shaking, listening to the ringing in his ears. He had just defeated a reinforced patrol with a shovel, a few sacks of brick, and the unrelenting force of gravity. Vernon Hayes didn't walk back to his unit looking for a medal. He vomited in the corner of the loft, climbed down, and returned to his patrol without saying a word. But in a combat zone, secrets have a way of leaking out. By noon the next day, the story of the ghost sniper who killed 8 men without firing a shot had circulated through the company. A lieutenant named Morrison, an Iowa farm boy who, like Hayes, understood the structural anatomy of a barn, went to investigate. He found the widened chute, the scratches on the concrete, and the pile of split sandbags. He didn't write a report. He simply nodded, went to the company armorer, and requisitioned more sandbags. Within 48 hours, the Hayes kill slot had metastasized across the sector. By June 10th, barns throughout the 82nd Airborne's area of operations were being retrofitted. By June 12th, the tactic had crossed division lines to the 101st. The German response was immediate and confused. Oberst Heinrich Vogel of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment filed a baffled report describing a new type of overhead assault and recommending that troops avoid agricultural buildings. But this order created a tactical paradox. The Normandy bocage offered little shelter from the relentless rain. The Germans were forced to choose: sleep in the hedgerows and risk hypothermia, or enter a barn and risk being crushed. Those who chose the barns were forced to adapt their entry drills. Patrols would enter and immediately scan the ceiling, looking for the telltale kill slot. But that upward glance cost them a crucial 3 seconds of focus, a momentary pause that allowed American infantry waiting outside to initiate an ambush. The Germans were effectively checkmated. Look up and get shot, or don't look up and get crushed. The statistical impact was undeniable. In the first week of the invasion, German patrols killed 47 American paratroopers in barn encounters. By the 3rd week, after the kill slots were widely deployed, that number dropped to 4, a 91% reduction in casualties. Conversely, German effectiveness plummeted. Terrified of the barns, Wehrmacht soldiers bivouacked in the mud, causing exposure-related casualties like trench foot and pneumonia to spike by 35%. Hayes hadn't just secured a building, he had weaponized the weather itself. Official military history is rarely kind to the individual innovator. In the final tactical bulletins of July 1944, the kill slot was credited to tactical innovation by 16th Corps staff. There was no mention of Vernon Hayes. He never requested a correction. He mustered out in October 1945 with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star for unrelated actions, then simply went home. Hayes returned to Salina, Kansas, bought a small farm with his discharge pay, and did exactly what he had done before the war. He grew wheat. He was a man who had killed 9 enemy soldiers in 4 minutes using nothing but physics, yet his obituary in 1983 didn't even mention the event. His own children remained unaware of his specific heroism until a military historian contacted them in 1997. But Hayes did have one moment of quiet reckoning. In 1956, he picked up a young hitchhiker wearing an 82nd Airborne uniform. The boy mentioned that his father had fought in Normandy and survived. Hayes didn't recognize the name, but he realized the implication. Because of those sandbags, and because of that re-engineered barn floor, hundreds of men came home who might otherwise have died in the dark. Children grew up with fathers because a Kansas farmer understood gravity. This is the enduring lesson of Vernon Hayes. Real innovation in war doesn't come from committees or research and development labs. It comes from the bottom up, from the grunts, the mechanics, and the farmers who are forced to solve impossible problems when the manual fails. It comes from men who understand that when the penalty for failure is death, you don't wait for permission. You dig a hole, you drop a bag, and you let gravity do the rest.